Today I'm presenting a technical artist guide to profiling in Unreal Engine. So in this talk, I'll present an accessible workflow for technical artists and other technically minded people to efficiently profile worst performing areas of the game with the goal of quickly determining the most effective optimizations to recommend to content teams. This is not intended to be a comprehensive overview of all available performance tools in Unreal Engine or an expert-level talk on low-level optimization techniques. And some context is that I've worked with a lot of technical artists, but also environment artists who are technical, QA, even producers who want to have a better understanding of how to optimize and how to find good optimizations. But they don't know where to put an effort. They don't know what tool to use for the job. They don't know what all the bars and colors mean if you open up a profile in Insights, for example. And they also don't have a good idea when to stop and pass the investigation off to a subject matter expert when the time is right. So first of all, we'll figure out where we want to focus, where to start. There are a couple different approaches, and we're going to start with some that aren't technically profiling, but they are important for maintaining optimized content. First of all, we'll want to proactively check all our art assets as they go into the editor with Unreal Engine's data validation plugin. Some examples of this are simple and complex collision, landscape grass distance culling, material count and layer count, mesh density and max poly count, and also map checks. On the implementation side, this is a little bit technical, so if you're a technical artist, you'll want to work with engineering on this. And once they've established a framework, TechArt can definitely help write individual checks. I also recommend doing this in C++ for efficiency, especially if you have a lot of content, but also to make sure that you're keeping iteration times down for your content creators. On the content creator side, it's really easy, and there are a couple different options for using validation. So first of all, you can manually run it through the content browser, but we've also added a customization, a perforce trigger that's used to require validation on submission via view changes. And then this will also show up in the change list description, so you can easily verify that all content is being validated. We're also running validation nightly via the build machine, and then we'll get a long list of any validation errors that have popped up, and we can communicate that easily to our content creators via Slack, or use whatever communication channels you prefer using. Secondly, we can keep an eye on all assets currently used in the game. And there are a couple really good tools for doing this. The first one is Tools Audit Asset Audit, which you can see on the right-hand side. And this is really helpful for gathering data on assets. Usually we are looking at static meshes, and it's a little tricky to actually get that information if you're not familiar with this tool. Once you have the asset audit open, you'll want to go to Add Asset Class and then type in Use Static Mesh, and then you'll see static mesh pop up. You can select that, and then on the left-hand side, you can filter down to just static meshes, which will give you all this beautiful data. There's a lot of data in here, and I'll get to that in a sec, how we want to process that. The other tool I want to mention really quick is statistics, and statistics is used to gather data on objects while you're running Pi. So here's an example of that, and one thing that's really helpful in here is instance count. So we can take the other data that was from asset audit, including poly count, material count, dimensions, is nanite enabled, combine that with instances used in game, and then we can start processing that data. Both these tools allow you to export CSV, And then TechArt can write Python scripts to generate additional metrics based on exported data. They can filter data just to assets that are relevant to each of the content teams that they are working with. And they can also apply conditional color coding to help content creators understand where to focus their optimization efforts. So over here, we have an example of doing that, grabbing all that data, manipulating it, coming up with a new metric, and then displaying it in a way that's easily digestible for content creators so that they know exactly where to focus their efforts. Then lastly, in order to use the team's time most effectively, we want to make sure that we're focusing our profiling and optimization efforts on the content that will give us the biggest bang for the buck. And ultimately, our goal here is to make sure that the game is running at a reasonable frame rate. It's lovely if all of our content is well organized, but at the end of the day, what we really care about is the game itself. So another call out is there are a lot of really helpful visual debugging tools, and I feel that artists, especially being visual people, they tend to gravitate toward those debug modes, but they don't always provide you information about bottlenecks, for example. So you can spend all day optimizing for a particular debug mode, but that might not even be the bottleneck, and then you won't actually see any big change in frame rate. So in order to help focus efforts, the first thing that we want to look at is something like a performance map, like the one over here that we've developed internally. This was created by our engineering team, and every so often our build machine automatically captures data based on user-added POI markers. If you see the little red squares on the right-hand side, those are our POI markers. There are some that have already been placed, but any user can add additional POI markers for any location that they would like to have more data for. Frame data is also captured to help provide insight into bottlenecks. So if you look down on the lower half of the screen, you'll see information including game thread time, render thread time, GPU time. This is helpful both to figure out what the biggest bottleneck might be in a certain area, but you can also compare different captures to see if there's been a regression, for example. So it's helpful for tracking data over time. The seat map is super easy to use. It's very helpful, and I highly suggest creating something like this in order to focus your team. So next, we'll talk about reproducible performance testing. We'll want to pinpoint a location for performance testing, but we also want to ensure that we are profiling in a reproducible way. This is especially important when you're testing optimizations in addition to profiling. So, how do we set up for our investigations? First of all, we'll want to launch the game. You'll want to, before you even launch the game, start Unreal Insights via the Unreal editor. It's best to do this beforehand because late connecting can potentially lead to data issues, so just to be safe, we'll do that first. Next, we'll want to run a development build of the game. This is going to provide us the most information during profiling compared to a test build where a lot of that information is stripped out. But in general, we'll run fast enough to be generally representative of what we're trying to profile. We do want to be mindful, though, that it's not going to be exactly representative. So debug is sometimes going to impact performance, and we should keep that in mind when we're looking at our profiles. Also in UGS, you'll probably want to confirm that you're synced to a similar change list as the build to ensure that symbols match, just in case that's necessary later. Once the game's running, use this trace.stop command to avoid generating a large trace file. Sometimes it'll take several minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes to find the spot that you're trying to profile. We don't want to be generating gigabytes and gigabytes of data while we're just trying to find the spot that we care about. It'll also make it more difficult to find the spot that you're trying to profile later on. Then we'll proceed to the area identified on the heat map in the last step. And one additional feature of the tool that we created is that when you select a region, it will create a bug@go command that we can paste into the command prompt later to get right to where we want to go. So once we've arrived in that location, we'll want to pinpoint exactly where we want to test. So that's not just position, it's also like camera orientation. So if I'm looking this way, performance might be fine. But if I rotate this way, it might get really bad. So we'll want to keep that in mind too, looking all around to figure out where that worst spot is that we want to dig into. Unreal provides several helpful stat commands to track performance at a high level. For example, stat FPS. That will bring up a small panel on the right-hand side of the screen that tracks information on what your frame rate is, but it's small and it can be difficult to track it, especially when you're running around the game, maybe fighting a boss. And we wanted to create something that's a little bit easier to track, which you can see below. It's part of our in-game performance monitor that engineering built using IAM-GUI. Lives at the bottom of the screen. You can actually move it around a little bit, which is helpful. And you can see it out of the corner of your eye when you're playing, which is super, super helpful. So I think I have an example here. So as you can see, this is totally fine, but we look at this field of glass and that looks a little suspicious. So I go back to verify and you know what? I think this is an area over here that I want to dig into. So once we've identified the specific spot we want to profile, we may want to prepare for an A/B test if we plan on testing optimizations in the future. So by A/B test, what I mean is verifying optimizations by comparing performance with and without the optimization, ensuring that the optimization is the only thing or close to it in the frame that has changed. So a couple things that you'll want to do to prepare for that, run bug@go command and save off the results. That'll get both your position and orientation. You'll want to consider controlling all game state conditions that can cause differences between captures. So a lot of this is going to be movement related. So if you're using a time of day system, you'll want to control that. Weather, wind, wetness, that will also want to be controlled. Any kind of ambient movement where things are swaying back and forth a little bit, that can have an impact. Any animated geometry. So movement is the big theme here. The biggest thing that's probably going to be moving around your screen is actually the character. So you may also want to consider hiding the character. We created a custom command, hide player, in order to do this. This was implemented via the custom cheat manager. And one thing to keep in mind if you decide to do this yourself is make sure that all the components are hidden too, which will require a little bit of piping data around. This is all really helpful so that you can literally flip between screens and see exactly what's changing, not just from a performance standpoint, but also from a visual standpoint. Because sometimes when we optimize, there might be slight visual changes, and we want to catch those and make sure that we're okay with them. On the flip side, also keep in mind that if you're doing this, you're removing things that could potentially be expensive. So double check, make sure that when you disable these features, that they're not the things that are adding significant cost. In that case, you will want to keep them on and dive into the profiles with characters, motion, etc. enabled. A couple other helpful hotkeys and commands. So there's slow-mo 0, which pauses the game, really helpful when you're trying to pinpoint an exact frame during a cinematic or similar. But you can also create custom key bindings by editing default input INI, which you can submit, and the entire team will have access to that. Alternatively, you can edit your local app data user input INI and add whatever commands you would like to use personally. A few examples that we've added, if on the numpad, you hit the period key, that does slow-mo 1, alt period does slow-mo 0.1, and control period does slow-mo 0.01. So that way we can very carefully step through and find the exact frame that we want to profile. Another helpful tool is console variables editor for batching commands. I've already mentioned a few. There are a few more that I'm going to mention after this. So that's absolutely worth investigating in order to make your workflow more efficient. Okay, so next we're going to determine bottlenecks. Now that we know where we want to focus, what tools do we want to use to gather more information? So the first thing we'll want to do is check stat unit. This will bring up a panel on the right-hand side of the screen with a couple of different timings. There's game, frame, draw, GPU time. And what we'll want to do is compare these against each other to figure out where the bottleneck most likely is. First thing we want to check is if game is close to frame. This is likely a game thread bottleneck if we see this happening, and the next step in that case would be to perform an Unreal Insights trace. If draw is close to frame, this is likely a render thread bottleneck. And because it's also a CPU issue, we'll still want to perform a Unreal Insights trace. However, if GPU time is close to frame, then it's probably a GPU bottleneck. And in that case, Unreal Insights might provide some basic information, but ultimately we'll probably end up in profile GPU or a dedicated GPU debugger in order to diagnose what the issue is. Because those numbers tend to jump around frame to frame, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to do that comparison. So it could help to visualize it in a graph, and there are a couple options for that. There's actually a built-in command in Unreal stat unit graph, which will create a small graph in the corner of your screen, and it's color-coded based on the panel in the corner. We created our own version of this, which is part of the performance monitor that I mentioned earlier, so we can see that see those stats over a longer period of time. Now that we know what tools we want to use to profile our issues, we can do a deep dive. So, what are common patterns we should look for, and when should we consider passing the investigation to someone else? First, we'll start with CPU bottlenecks in Unreal Insights. So before we run the trace, we'll want to prepare and run the command stats verbose named events. This will start, and then we start the trace with the command trace start. Optionally, you can use these commands to identify specific frames in your trace. There's trace bookmark and trace screenshot. These are really helpful because you might have tens or hundreds or even thousands of frames in Insights. If you use these commands, it'll place a little marker in your graph so that you can find it far more easily. So I definitely recommend using these. You can create custom key bindings, which is really helpful. And then also in our performance monitor, there's a frame number stat. So that way, if we're doing a video recording, we can compare the video itself against our Unreal Insights trace. And having context is really helpful. So for example, if you're seeing a lot of physics stuff going on in the trace, and then you look at the frame and there's a big explosion, you have a better, much faster understanding of what might be contributing to your performance problems. Once you've captured enough data, we usually run for a couple seconds at a minimum. You stop the trace with the command trace stop, and then we'll switch to Unreal Insights. Select the trace that we just captured and press Open Trace. If for whatever reason you don't see the trace there, just confirm that the directory containing the trace is included in the list of directories to monitor. And once Insights is open, you'll want to look at the top panel, called the Frames panel, to start identifying low frame rate areas. So you can see an example over here, and there are two types of low frame rate areas that we're looking for. The first type is a hitch, which you see on the left-hand side, and it's that tiny little one-frame spike. The other area to the right is a consistently low frame rate area. When tech artists or others are first getting started looking at insights captures, I typically recommend to look at the consistent low FPS areas first. It's usually a little bit easier to diagnose. It's also usually more often content related, so it's easier to find actionable optimization recommendations by looking in those areas. Next, we will select a frame in that frames panel that we'd like to dig into, which you see up top here, the little blue box. The selected frame will also be highlighted in the timings view panel below, which you can see that blue, large blue highlighted area there. And it's always a good idea to confirm the bottleneck. Even though by comparing those stats earlier, we got a good sense of where it probably is, never hurts to look at your trace and identify the bottleneck. So if you look at this one here, we see that there's a large section of the GPU track where nothing is happening. Down below in the game thread, there's a lot of stuff going on. So this confirms our hypothesis that, you know what, this is probably a CPU issue, specifically a game thread issue, and the GPU is stalling because it doesn't have any work to do, because the CPU is still figuring out what needs to be done next. The next step of this is that you'll want to figure out what the specific issue is. So we know it's CPU, we know it's game thread, but what specifically about the game thread is the issue? If we look in this example, we'll see that there's a lot of physics stuff going on. And this looks like a little suspicious, probably, I'm guessing 10 milliseconds of physics work. Another thing you'll want to make sure that you have is budgets, both for the CPU, but also for the GPU. And you'll look at this, guesstimate that there's about 10 milliseconds here. You'll compare that against your CPU budgets, and physics might be 2 or 3 milliseconds, and you're like, wait a minute, that seems expensive. So that's the point where you need to either drill down into this. If we skip ahead, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff underneath. So those are probably specific physics-related actors that we can zoom into. There might be a theme, maybe there's a rock that's really expensive and it's duplicated hundreds or thousands of times. And we'll be able to see that once we zoom in and catch that, and maybe there's a VFX tag attached to it. And we know that's the team that we probably want to reach out to and let them know, hey, we found this thing, could you look into optimizing it? There are other times where there isn't obvious content that is connected to a category that's way over budget. And in that case, it's usually a good time to hand this investigation off to a subject matter expert. So for example, a physics programmer who might be able to dig into this more with all the context of what is going on. I wouldn't recommend for tech artists or others to spend time trying to learn the entire physics system when it's a lot more efficient to just pass it off. All right, so here's another example. We're looking at the RHI thread and the render thread here. And if you look at this one, there's a 36 millisecond deferred shading scene renderer, and then we look at that, and 28.6 milliseconds of that is some force map scene. That's definitely over budget too. This is still CPU issue, but this is a good example of there's no real content here that we can make recommendations to the content team. So this is probably something that we want to hand off to an engineer and figure out, okay, why is this thing taking basically a frame's worth of time in order to process? Moving along to GPU bottlenecks, we can also see issues in Unreal Insights. Capturing a trace and viewing here will provide a high-level amount of information on GPU work. So again, we're going to confirm our bottlenecks. We look at the GPU thread, looks pretty busy. Then we look down at the game thread, and I see game thread wait for task, game thread idle time, and then CPU, a bunch of little CPU stalls. So this indicates to me that the issue is the GPU. But there isn't a ton of information in here. Obviously, we can compare these high-level categories against our GPU budgets to see, generally speaking, where we might be over. So for example, nanite Viz buffer seems a little high, and shadow depth seems a little high. But we can't get any information about specific assets that might be causing these performance issues. So we're going to dig a little deeper. The first thing you'll want to do is run the following commands to make sure that there's enough detailed information in the profile that you're about to do. The first one is r.show material draw events 1. That's for everything that's non-nanite. And then also r.nanite.show mesh draw events 1, and that's for everything that is nanite. You'll also want to disable async compute, and then run the command profile GPU. Just a side note, if you're certain that the GPU is the issue and it's not CPU, it is okay to do this in the editor Pi, if that saves you time, especially if you're iterating on optimizations. And also, if you're running from a build, the results of this profile will dump into a log file in your project saved folder, which you can then open up in Unreal Editor. And then also, if Unreal Insights and Profile GPU aren't able to provide enough information, I think that's the point where, again, you want to pull in an engineer and dig even deeper with a dedicated GPU profiler. For example, PIX if you're doing PC or Xbox, or Razer if you're doing PlayStation. And then you can get even more information, but that's a whole nother talk. It's very complex. So here's an example of Profile GPU, and there are two parts to this interface. The top part has a bunch of colored bars, and the bottom part has more detailed text information. The idea here is we just want to follow the biggest color bars. So in this example, I just start expanding, and I'm like looking for the really big chunky bars, expand it some more, keep expanding, and I'm just like drilling all the way down until I can't expand anymore. And then can't do anything more, so I go down to this bottom panel, I keep expanding one more time, and I find that there is a material glass, thickness simple. Glass is usually expensive. Maybe there's too much glass on screen or too many features are enabled, but that's where I'd really focus on my investigations. All right, so moving along to gaining traction on the optimizations that we've identified in our profiling. How do we help the responsible team get traction? A lot of times as a tech artist, you find the thing that's expensive and you're like, oh, like it's right there. But then content creators, engineers, they don't know what to do with that information immediately. First of all, it's helpful to have a central location for communicating about and discussing findings. For example, a Slack channel is really helpful here. That's what we use, and for every performance issue we find, we'll make a new post and then start a discussion in the thread where we figure out, like, oh, like, do we have all the information? Can anyone else provide context? Who is this best suited to send to? And that's been really, really helpful. Once we get to the point that we are either starting that new post or creating a JIRA issue if we're ready to assign the work out to someone, there's a lot of information that we want to include. So we've created a checklist to help people make sure that all that info is there. First off, you want to have a really clear, concise issue summary. You'll want to include a JIRA link once the JIRA has been created. You'll want to do a basic analysis of what the problem is. So as a tech artist, I wouldn't worry too much if you don't know exactly why the physics system is so expensive. Just do the best you can, so that way all the work that you've done with the analysis can be passed off to the next person. If you're developing on multiple platforms, you'll want to include that information. If you're developing on PC, you'll want to also include which GPU you're using. You'll want to include clear reproduction steps. So if a programmer wants to try recreating this later and attach a debugger, they know exactly what to do. Next, include the change list for the instance of the game that the issue was found on. If it's available, include the trace frame number or the frame number of the build of the issue in the build. Then as much media as you can provide, like the better. Really, really helpful. So screenshots, videos, anything you can provide to help provide context. Then provide a screenshot of the trace with the area of concern highlighted, similar to what I did earlier in this presentation. And then finally, the location of the trace file, if you put it up in the network, that way someone can easily grab it if they want to dig a little deeper. To help guide this process, I highly recommend working with a producer to create a JIRA template with applicable fields pre-filled, so that way you can even just have a button where anyone who's doing profiling can click that button and then easily fill out with the information above. I also suggest creating a dashboard for tracking all active performance issues, which I have an example of here. This is really helpful just to make sure that you're continuing to drive these optimizations forward. We have ours broken down by team, so you can see what environment art needs to do, engineering, tech art, et cetera. We can also see recently created issues and then a burn down chart too, to make sure that we're actually making the progress that we want to see and hitting all of our performance goals. So, starting to wrap things up now, I've included some documentation for tools and other tech that I've mentioned in my presentation, so definitely recommend checking out these links. And then also, once you're at the point where you've figured out, okay, it's shadow pass issue. Matt Astley did a great talk last year where he drills into each of those categories and displays tools that are really helpful for gathering more information to provide to your content teams. So I just want to say thank you to everyone at Crystal Dynamics and our partners who contributed toward the workflows and tech presented in this talk. Engineering, tech art, production too. And also thank you to Epic for organizing in RealFest Orlando 2025. Thank you.